Assalamu alaikum students. I hope you all are well, safe and healthy at home. I'm your course instructor Fazana Khan. Welcome to all of you in this class of literary studies. And in today's class, I am going to discuss about the age of Milton. Previously, you were taught about the Renaissance age, or you can say the literature of Renaissance or the literature of Elizabethan age. And in this class, we will talk about the 17th century literature, which this age specifically is called the Age of Milton. It is also called the Revolutionary Age or the Puritan Age too. So let's start from the topic. As I already told you that literature is always the depiction of the society. As literature is the depiction of the society, so it's very important to understand the society of the particular age to understand the literature. So for understanding the literature of Puritan age, first of all we need to talk about the social background, some important characteristics of 17th century. So this is basically the age of English bourgeois revolution and restoration. So 17th century is called the Restoration and Revolution age. It was the age of the weakening of the tie between monarchy and bourgeois. Bourgeois is basically called the middle class. So at that time, even in the 17th century, there were weak ties between monarchy and the parliament. The clashes between the king and the parliament. It was the time of the clashes between the king and the parliament, basically the Puritan age, or we can say the late Renaissance age. There were clashes between the king and the parliament. It was the age of the outburst of the English Revolution, the split between the revolutionary camp, so bourgeois dictatorship and the restoration time. So this is basically, we can say these are the characteristics of the age of 17th century. So let's talk about further that what happened. Before moving towards the literature of the particular times, I like to tell you about the historical events of the particular age. So keep it in your mind. Here we are talking about the 17th century. So let me tell you the historical background, the monarchy and the kingship of in England at that time. So as previously you were taught about the Elizabethan age, you all are very well aware that Elizabethan queen was a very famous queen. She had literary taste, and due to her interest in literature, there was a lot of development and improvement in the literature in 16th century. But if we talk about the 17th century, this age is also called the non-dramatic literature. The literature which was produced in this age, it is called the non-dramatic literature. So in this age, basically the poetry was very popular, and there was no proper, we can say, the dramatist in the 17th century. Okay, let me tell you about the Elizabethan time. Basically, after Elizabethan, what happened? In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, right? And after that, James I became the king. Keep it in your mind that Queen Elizabeth was a virgin queen. She had no children because she didn't marry. So the reign of James I starts from 1603. So James I is basically was the relative of Queen Elizabeth. So after the death of the Queen Elizabeth, James I became the king in 1603. And he remained the king till 1625. So the period from 1603 till 1625 is called the Jacobean age. So the question arises that why it is called the Jacobean age. Basically, the Latin name of the King James I was Jacobus. So on the basis of his name, this age is called the Jacobean age. And James first died in 1625. And after that, Charles I, he became the king. Charles I is basically the son of James I. So this time can be called the reign of Charles or the Caroline age. So the question arises why it is called the Caroline age, because the Latin name of the Charles I was basically Carolus. So on the basis of his name, this age is called the Caroline age. So from 1625 to 1649, Charles I remained the king, but he was a weak king. So basically he imposed a lot of taxes. He married to a Catholic lady, and in the parliament there were majority of the members were Protestant. So they were not in favor of the Charles I. Finally, it was this time that Puritans were raising their voice. So on the force of Puritans, the literature theatres closed in 1642. Right, so theatre closed in 1642, and it was the time of the Charles I. So Charles had no good relations with the parliament. So parliament was against the Charles. So a civil war started at that time, and Charles I was imprisoned and executed. So this is the time 1649. In 1649, Charles I basically executed, and his son with his wife, he had two sons and a wife. They basically left the England and went to France. So after that, from 1649 till 1660, the time was called the Commonwealth time, the interim period of Commonwealth. Basically at that time, the Cromwell Oliver was the member of the parliament, along with this Milton was there. So Cromwell Oliver was the man who managed the political affairs. So from 1649 till 1660, there was no king in England. So after that, Charles II came back to England from France. Charles II is the son of the Charles I, who basically left the England when his father was executed. So he came back to England in 1660, and at that time the monarchy was restored. That's why this time period is called the Restoration Age. From 1660 till 1688, this time period is called the Restoration Age, because from 1660 the Charles II came to power and the monarchy was restored. Charles II basically died in 1685, and after that his brother, because he had no son, so his brother James II or James II, he became the king in 1685, and he remained there till 1688. After that, again there was civil war. The parliament was against the King James II, and finally he left the kingship and went to France. So it was the time of the Glorious Revolution. And after that, King James II flees to 1688. He went to France, and then William III and Mary II in 1689 came to power. Mary II died in 1694 and William III died in 1703. So this is the historical political background of the age of you can say of the 17th century, that how the 17th century passed in England, how the monarchy continued, how the king came and how did they perform. So theatres were closed in 1642, But the Charles II, in the time of the Restoration, when Charles II came to power, so he was a literary figure. He had interest in literature. So at that time, the theaters were reopened in 1660. So the time period of James I and Charles I, this time period is called the Puritan Age because it's the time of the rise of the Puritan, and this age is also called the Milton's Age, right? And the reign of the Charles II and James II, this is called the Restoration Age. So in this class, we will specifically talk about the Puritan Age, which is the age of Milton or the age of revolution, in which James I and the Charles I were the king, and this age is also called the late Renaissance. So let's talk about the English Revolution and Puritanism. The English Revolution was carried out under a religious cloak. Because the revolution came due to the Puritanism, and their focus was more on religion. So English Revolution, also called the Puritan Revolution. The Puritan movement aimed to make man honest and to make man free from worldly pleasures because they condemned the worldly pleasures as harmful. So the triumph of Puritanism under Cromwell Oliver, basically it was the time when the revolution came. So basically they passed the severe laws for the betterment because they wanted to make the man honest. So until the end of the Commonwealth, as I already told you, that after the execution of Charles I, it was the time of the Commonwealth when there was no king. So there were two leaders in the England. Cromwell Oliver, he was the man of action, and Milton, he was the man of thought. So if we talk about the literature of revolution period, then let me tell you that in literature, due to the breaking up of the old idols, the Puritans believed in simplicity of life. So they disapproved of the sonnets and the love poetry written in the previous period, and literature was as divided in spirit as were the struggling parties. So as literature is the depiction of the society of the time, so at that time literature in the Puritan age expressed age and basically expressed the sadness of that particular age. Even its brightest hours were followed by gloomy and pessimism. So romantic order cannot be found in the literature of Puritan period. They depicted the sadness, the gloomy of the time. One of the major writers of that time was John Milton, and his poetry basically depicts the sadness and gloomy of that particular time. So John Milton, whose work would glorify any age and people, and in his work the indomitable revolutionary spirit found its noblest expression. For this reason, this period is also called the Age of Milton because he was the prominent figure at that time. So the main literary form of the period was poetry. As I already told you that the 17th century is called, the literature of the 17th century is called the non-dramatic literature because in the 17th century, even in Caroline period, Jacobean period, and after that, the Restoration Age, which is also called the Dryden Age, the focus was more on poetry than on dramas and plays. So besides Milton, there were two other groups of poets, the metaphysical poets and the cavalier poets. So before moving towards the Milton, let me tell you about the metaphysical poets and the cavalier poets. Basically, the metaphysical poets appeared at the beginning of the 17th century, or this time is also called the late Renaissance because Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and it is considered the basically the time when the Renaissance started to end. So early 17th century is basically called the time, also the time of late Renaissance. So the metaphysical poets are those poets who sought to shatter myths and replace them with new philosophies, new sciences, new world, and new poetry. They came up with the new ideas in the poetry. They used more concepts in the poetry. So basically, the word metaphysical is basically a philosophical concept used in literature where poets portray the thoughts, things, ideas that are beyond the depiction of physical existence. From etymological point of view, basically the word first the metaphysical is basically the combination of the two words, meta and physical. So the first word meta means beyond. So, and physical means the world. So it means beyond the world. So what they write, they basically write the ideas which were beyond the world. So the meanings are clear here that it deals with the objects, ideas that are beyond the existence of the physical world. So it was the point of the metaphysical poetry. So metaphysical poetry is a genre of poetry that deals with deep and profound subjects like spirituality, religion, etc. It is highly intellectual form of poetry and presents the world to its readers in a different way. It asks questions about the science and it asks such type of questions that science cannot answer even. So metaphysical poetry prompts the readers to question their reality and existence. It takes one beyond the physical world and gives new perspective through its imagery, wit, and paradox. So these are this we can consider the characteristics of the metaphysical poetry, that in which they basically show the images, it increases the imagination of the person, and it shows the more images which cannot exist in the world. So when we talk about the metaphysical poets, basically the John Donne was the most famous poet. He has been called the founder of the metaphysical school. His masterpiece is Songs and Sonnets, The Sun Rising and the Flea. It has been stated about them that were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. They neither copy nature nor life. Thoughts are often new but seldom natural. So along with John Donne, Ibrahim Coley, Richard Crashaw, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, and Thomas were basically the persons who are called the metaphysical poets. So in the 17th century, in the early 17th century, one class was metaphysical poets, and other group of poets is basically the Cavalier poets. As I already told you that first of all, after the Elizabethan Queen, James I came, and after that Charles I came. So Charles I was executed. So these are those poets who were in favor of Charles I, or you can say the supporter of King Charles I, and during this English Civil War. So most of these poets were courtiers and the soldiers of the Charles I. So they sided with the king to fight against the revolution. They supported the King Charles I during the English Civil War. So King Charles was a commissioner of the fine arts and therefore demanded their creation, masks, poetry, and drama. And if we talk about the important poets of this group, Cavalier poets, basically the Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, Francis Queries, Sir John Suckling, Richard Lovelace, and Andrew Marvell. These are the poets who are called the Cavalier poets. These are basically the poets who were in favor of Charles I. They were the supporter of Charles I. Let's talk about the John Milton. He has been called the most important literary figures of 17th century. Most important poet of the 17th century. He born in December 9th, December 1608 in London. He died on November 8th, November 1674 So his full name was John Milton. If we talk about his education, he got the degree from the University of Cambridge. He studied in the School of St. Paul's School, London. He attended the Christ's College in Cambridge. So John Milton was an English poet. So he was the scholarly man of letters at that time, and he was the civil servant for Commonwealth. Commonwealth, you all are aware, the time period when there was no king. Oliver Cromwell, who was the member of the parliament, so the England was under the rule of the Oliver Cromwell. So at that time he was a civil servant. John Milton had good relation with Oliver Cromwell, and due to these relations he suffered a lot in the Restoration period. So let's talk about the literary time period of John Milton. The first period, there is a division in the periods of John Milton's time. So the first period basically closing with the end of his Cambridge career in 1632. So his first work is an ode he has written on the morning of Christ's nativity. It's far from perfect. So a remarkable production for a poet of 21st. And his second period, literary period, is the period, the Houston period, which closed basically with his departure for the continent in 1638, in which he has written the 4 minor poems, Such Beauty and Power. These are basically the poems which has been written by Milton during his second period. El Allegro, Tu Penseroso, Commerce, and Lycidas. These are the important literary work of his second period. So when we talk about the third period, literary period of Milton, this is the period of prose writing. From this period starts from 1640 till 1660. So he 20 years continued actively writing the prose. He has written dozens of sonnets with heavy style. So modern English prose had not yet come into existence at that time. So he has written the most important prose work at that. Areopagitica is one of the important works in which he has written a plea for freedom of thought and speech, which is read by every lover of literature and intellectual liberty. So this is basically his third period of English literature. His last period, or we can say his last literary period, is basically the most important period of his great achievement, in which he has created the masterpieces, because he has written the Paradise Lost. This is basically English heroic verse without rhyme. And he has written Paradise Regained. He has written Samson Agonists. So he has written Paradise Lost basically to justify the ways of God to man. It was the theme of writing the Paradise Lost. About all, he has written Paradise Lost to tell about the fall of man, man's disobedience, and the loss of paradise. Satan is the real hero of the poem in the Paradise Lost. Adam is a character in the Paradise Lost, the first human, the father of our race. And there is another character, Eve. She is the wife of the Adam, the first woman, and the mother of mankind. God the Father creates the world by means of God the Son creating Adam and Eve last. So God the Son, Jesus Christ, offers himself as a sacrifice to pay for the sins of mankind. So he has written the masterpiece of his life, the Paradise Lost, in the last period, which is basically the fifth period of his literary work. It was all about the work of Milton and a little bit about the life of the Milton. Let me tell you the features of Milton's poetry. Great revolutionary poet of 17th century was Milton. So he is also an outstanding political pamphleteer of the Revolution period. He made a strong influence on the later progressive English poets. He had a great style of writing. So his poetry has a grand style. That is because he became a lifelong study of classical and biblical literature. So he is basically the great master of blank verse. He has written Paradise Lost in the blank verse. He is the glorious pioneer to introduce blank verse into non-dramatic poetry. So he has used it as the main tool in his masterpieces Paradise Lost. His blank verse is rich in every poetic quality and never monotonous. He wrote the greatest epic in English literature, which is Paradise Lost. He made a strong influence on later English poetry. His poetry is noted for sublimity of thought and majesty of expression because his style is sublime. So it's all about Milton and the age of the Milton. So in today's class, I told you the historical background of the 17th century, and we have just talked about the Puritan age, which starts we basically discussed about the start of the 17th century, which can be divided into the Puritan age, and Puritan age further can be divided into Jacobean and Carolingian age. So in the next class, we will talk about the Restoration age, which is also called the age of Dryden too. So in next class, I'll explain to you about the next age, Restoration age, in which we will talk about the literature of the Restoration time. So I hope the points which I have explained in this class are pretty clear into your mind now. In case of any confusion, I do suggest you again that you need to read the book of Critical History of English Literature by Weir Mullick, and in case of further issue and confusion, then you can contact me. We can discuss in the class discussion room, and you can discuss with me in the WhatsApp group too. So stay at home, keep yourself and your family safe from COVID-19, and take care. Allah Hafiz.